Hey, what is up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. This is part 2, the second part of this blog post layout where I'm showing you how to lay out a page with both grid and Flexbox and when you might choose one over the other depending on kind of the section on the page. Last time we looked at the HTML, so if you're interested in that, go ahead and check that out. This time we're looking at the CSS. Now, you don't have to have done the first one to follow along here, but that will probably help you as we reference classes and things like that we wrote last time in the markup. You can follow along with me if you come to this CodePen or this GitHub, and I'll leave a link in the description here. Just make sure that you click on the Lesson 2 starting point, and then you can download the code here and open it in any code editor. Or of course, you can just clone the whole thing and then navigate to this branch if that works for you. There is a live code, and I'll leave again a link in the description for you here. This shows kind of what we're going to be building out, and again, we did all the markup last time. There's one other thing I want to show you that I didn't show you last time, which is we are going to add a dark mode. So if I switch my machine to dark mode, you'll see that pretty quickly we can actually get something up and running that just uses a different color scheme based on the user's system, dark or light. So with it back in light mode here, let's go ahead and jump in, and I'm going to first look at the Figma that we started with last time. And if you want to jump ahead straight to the CSS, you can go ahead and do that. I am going to actually add a few things in HTML I forgot about last time. So either way, I've added timestamps below if you want to jump to one of those. But what I would like to do for those of you who stick around here for a few seconds is I want to just kind of think through this page, because I think taking a few seconds can really benefit you when it comes to laying out a page like this. So I want you to take note of two things, and these are the two things we're going to think about as we build out the CSS. The first would be different spacings. So all throughout this page, we've got different spacings like up top here on the left and right, between different items like this. Again, the padding on the left and right here, either side, the space between the author section and this, the space between these items, all of these spacings. So those kinds of things, it's really important that those are consistent on your page. We're going to use CSS variables to make sure that whenever we're selecting a spacing, we're kind of giving ourselves some options and then selecting between those. The second thing would be to look at font sizes. And once again, it's the same kind of thing. So you'll notice that we've got some capitalized sections. We added classes called capitalize on several of those, not all of them. And then we also have kind of these larger text and then smaller text here. The spacing between these paragraphs, again, connected to the line height and all that for these paragraphs. Then up top, we've got this H1 that's fairly large. So all those kinds of things are important as you go to lay out the site. And what we're going to do, again, is use CSS variables to kind of give ourselves different font sizes so we can select quickly between those and make sure that we're choosing consistent typography throughout the page. All right, so with that said, I do want to fix one thing that we forgot about in HTML and then add one thing we forgot about in HTML. So let's jump over and do that now. So the one thing we need to fix here is at the top, I realized after when I was editing the last video that I misspelled this. So this is capitalized like that. And there should actually be, yeah, so there's 3 others down here below. The other thing is we totally forgot about the author, poor guy. So there's supposed to be this section down here with the author. And we're going to do that just real briefly here in a div that we're going to call article author. I'll expand that out, and inside here, we're going to have 2 things. We're going to have an image. So I'll do an image here. This will have a class of article author image. I'll expand that out. And I think this is just under images. And I think we just called it John Doe. Yeah, JPEG. So I'll say John Doe. So that's the first thing. The second thing in here is another div. And this one has the class of article author details. I'll expand that out. And that's where we have the author's name and that kind of stuff. So the first thing was that H, I think we had it as a H3. And that's John Doe was his name, the guy who wrote it. Great guy, capitalized here again on a paragraph tag. And inside here, we're going to have a small tag. And then the text of this will be nutrition specialist. I'll expand that all out. And using that small tag kind of gives us a small font size by default, although we're going to end up customizing it anyhow. But just so you know about that tag, I think that's one that's easily overlooked. Finally, we do have just a plain paragraph tag here, and we just got some filler text that I'll expand out. Okay, so now we've got that all in there, and if I come over this way, he should be showing up here. Let's refresh. Okay, there we go. Okay, so his name, everything is set. Let's now go ahead and jump into the CSS. Now, before we do too much, we're going to do a few things just to kind of get some basic clear set up. So I'll set up a basic clear up top here, And then we're going to add a root variable up top. And in this root variable, which is the same as declaring the HTML, this is where we're going to go ahead and add several CSS variables. And this will give us consistent typography and spacing throughout the site. Before we get into spacing and typography, though, let's go ahead and work on our color scheme. So I'll add a little comment here just to kind of keep track of what we're doing. We're going to add colors, and we could add these as hex values, but I always like, especially when I'm alternating between dark and light mode, to add them as HSL values. And I'm actually going to break it out. So we're going to have the hue here of 36, which is our color. Saturation will be 100%. And I'm not going to add a lightness because we're going to add that for each individual color. Now we've got a light and a dark mode. So let's go ahead and start with the default light mode. And I don't want to name these like light and dark because we're going to switch between them as we switch the user system. So what we're going to do is just call this accent to start with. So the accent color will be our var of hue, and then we'll have a var of sat, and then finally we'll add the lightness ourselves here. Now you may notice here I'm not actually writing HSL and all this, so this actually isn't a color. It's just the numbers that go inside that, and I'll show you why I'm going to do that here in just a second. I'll copy this down 2 more times, and here we're going to have background like this, and we're going to change this final color here to 99%, which is a like almost white color. And then finally, we will have a text color, and we'll change this to 4%. So let's go ahead and start using these just so you can kind of see why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it here, and then we'll come back and fill in the rest of our colors. So if we come in here to our body and we say our background color should be, and here's where I'm actually going to type HSL. So I'll do HSL, and then we're going to do our var of background, just like that. Now, by doing it like this, let me actually make this a little bit more noticeable. Let's change this to like 49. What it allows me to do is in line here, if I wanted to have something a little bit different as far as the color, like a little bit more opaque or see-through, I could just do a / there and then like 0.4. And I can actually do those manually all throughout the site without having to redeclare a bunch of variables up top and have alpha channels for all these different variations I might want to have throughout the site. So I like to kind of keep the hue, saturation, and lightness their own little variables here, and then be able to just add HSL throughout the body, and I find that gives me more flexibility. So that's what we're doing here. I don't need that, and so I'm going to remove that for now, and we'll change this back to 99%. Now we do actually want to go ahead and copy this down, and we're going to change the color to our var of text. And it's always a good practice, I think, to have not like straight black, but rather some kind of just off black a little bit tied to whatever hue that you're working with. Now let's go ahead and just finish out the light dark mode because it's actually not that difficult. We're going to come in here and we've got a default light. Now we're going to also have a dark mode. So dark mode just like this, and all we're going to do is change these, and I'm going to grab each of these by hitting Command D after selecting the first one, and then I'll hit back 2 dashes and a dark. We're going to change these to be their own different colors here. So I'm going to change these, let's see, let's change this one will just be 60%, so it's going to be just slightly brighter actually than the light mode. And I am going to actually remove this default saturation and change this to 20%, and this will be 16%. Next, I'm going to come down here and change this to 15% brightness, and this will be 85% brightness. Now, how do we get this to actually show when we're in dark mode? Well, what I'm going to do is write a little media query. No JavaScript or anything is required. I'm just going to say media, and then we're going to do prefers, in parentheses here, prefers color scheme : dark. And when that's the case, I'm going to redeclare the root, and I'm just going to point those accent custom properties, CSS variables, to our var of accent dark, like that. And I'm going to copy all of these down and do the same thing. So we're going to change background like that, and then we're going to change text like that. Now, if I were to change my system over to dark mode, you'll see it updates automatically, and that's all there is to it. So it's really quick and easy if you're using CSS variables. All right, so I promised that we would talk about consistent spacing and typography. A lot of the beginning section here, just to kind of give you prep work, is going to be getting everything in place. Once we've got all these things in place, it's actually pretty quick to build out the page. But it's going to take a good bit of work to kind of get all these things in place so that we can quickly build it out. So in addition to colors, we also want consistent spacing. And what I'm going to do is just paste this in, and then I'm going to explain what I'm doing here. I've got a small, a medium, and a large spacer, and I'm going to use those to provide that consistent spacing. Now what I'm doing is using a clamp property, and I did a video on this recently that I'll link in the description, but what it's basically saying is, hey, at the smallest, I want you to be 12 pixels, at the largest, I want you to be 22 pixels, and then anywhere between, I think I have it set to like 350 pixels up to 1,000 pixels, I want you to actually linearly draw a line and get slowly bigger until you hit that 22 pixel mark. That's what I'm doing for each of these. Again, this would be 24 at the smallest, 40 at the tallest, or the largest, 32, and 75. Now, if you're interested in how I did this, in addition to that video, I think this CSS tricks article is really, really helpful, and I based some of the calculations off of this article as well. You can just come in here, and I've changed these to 350 and 1,000, and then put what size rem you want, or in my case, I did pixel, and he talks about how to do that in here. I'll link this in the description. It's really cool. It's helpful how he explains everything. And again, he's showing you, hey, at the smallest, it's going to be 1 rem here, and he has it going up to 3.5, and then it caps it at that. That's what this clamp property does. Now, you do need to know that this isn't totally supported across every browser, but the browser support is actually really good. And so I'm pretty confident in a lot of my sites. If it was a really important production site, I probably wouldn't use this without a fallback, but for the sake of this video, that's as much as I'll explain here, and you can check out that other video if you're interested. All right, and we'll see that in practice here in a moment. In addition to the layout, I'm also going to have different font sizes. We're going to start, because we're building it mobile first, with the default font size being 16 pixels, and we're going to actually ramp that up once we get to a desktop version. And then all I've done is declared a font size small, and then kind of gone all the way up to my largest font size. And again, I'm using that clamp property just the same all throughout. The last CSS variable I'm declaring here is a utility kind of feature here of just setting some transition to normal, so we can use that throughout the page as well. Okay, so we've got all the CSS variables in place. You don't have to write all these down. You can just copy them from the GitHub that I've linked below, but that explains kind of how to do it. Or you can come over here and calculate it yourself using this calculator that I showed you a second ago and copy that out. Okay, so what I've done here now is we've got everything ready to write some classes and then just declare some different properties on like our H1s and that kind of thing. So let's go ahead and start by saying our H1, our H2, our H3, and then we're going to have a class of H3, which I'll explain in a little bit here. And then our H4, we're going to have be font weight of bold. And then what we're going to do for each of these is we're going to take our H1 here. Let me scroll down here. And our H1 is going to have a font size of our var font 1, just like that. Now on this one, I'm also going to add a line height of 1 just to make sure the spacing is correct. But then for the rest of these here, let me just copy this down and remove this line height. And we'll copy this down 3 more times. And I'm going to change this one, grab that 1, hit Command D, change both of those to H2. Same thing here, hit that, hit H3. I'm also going to go ahead and add that class H3 here as well. And then come here again one more time and change this to font 4, just like that. So now we've got all of our fonts set up to where when we're using the correct semantics in HTML, the font size and all that will match what we want it to be. So I realized I never actually told you why I was doing that class of H3. It's because sometimes you might want to have the same styling as your H3, but you don't want it semantically to be an H3 in the HTML. So for instance, like you should only have one H1 per page, only a few H2s, a few H3s. So what you don't want is like 50,000 headers on each page, which sometimes people can do. And so sometimes you want the same styling, but without actually adding the tag H3. That's why I've done it this way. We're also going to say for all the paragraphs, we want them to have a line height of 1.4. We've got a couple other font things we need to worry about. Font sizing for small or a class of small. I don't remember if we used that or not, but it's another way of declaring what I did up here with this H3. So whether I'm using the small tag or I've got a class of small, I want the font size to be our var of font small. There we go. And lastly, we had that class of capitalized, and here we're going to change this to say text transform of uppercase. All right, and I'm going to save that there. Now let's jump back over and actually see some of the stuff we've been doing. So it's adjusted those font sizes properly. We don't have the right font in there yet. So before we do anything else, let's grab the right font. I'm using Enter here just from Google Fonts. And let's close this down and grab, I think I had the 400 and the 700. I'll open this back up. We could link it in the HTML, or I'm going to grab the import here. And let's just add this somewhere here. That'll work there. All right, and then I'm going to grab this font family and jump down to my body here and add that as my font family. So if I jump back over, this should now look correct. You'll notice as I shift this, it'll actually adjust. Now the spacing's not there yet, but the font size will actually adjust as I move, and you'll see it's just linearly kind of going down there as I get a little bit smaller. And that's the power of clamp. So you get these dynamic font size readjustments, and I think that's kind of cool, and I'm glad that CSS is getting there. Okay, so I know that was a lot to kind of get all those components set and ready to go, but now it'll actually be fairly quick to build out the page. Now let's think about the page itself. If we were to pull this up and just pull up the inspector here, you'll see that in this container we've got 4 things. We've got our header, we've got our share class, which is this image and those social icons here. We've got the article, which is the article and this author card, and then we've got the aside, which is the sidebar. So we've got 4 things. Generally speaking, when I'm laying out the kind of bare structure of a page, I like to use grid. And that's because it gives you a lot of flexibility to lay things out, not just horizontally, but vertically at the same time. So what we're going to do is come to our container here, and let's give ourselves some space first. All right, so I'm going to come in here to the container. We're going to say display of grid. Then I'm going to set the margin because I want some space up top here, and we're just going to use those spacers. So I'm going to say spacer medium and then 0 side to side. If I save it and I come up here, you'll notice now I've got space up top and I've got space down below. And grid by default is going to work top to bottom, so it hasn't changed the orientation of anything. But what we can do now is come in here and just say we want a gap in between each of those 4 sections of our var spacer, and we're going to use our var spacer of small actually. And if I save this here, you'll now notice that I've got space between all of these sections. And one easy way to see this is to hover or even click on that grid, and now you see them staying on the page. Even as I scroll, you see they stay, showing you here's this gap showing up between each of these sections. And gap for grid is actually really well supported in all the modern browsers. I think it's at like 93% or something like that if you check on Can I Use. Now we're going to set this whole thing up on a system of columns, and I'm going to use those columns to space things out as I want to from the sides. So follow with me here. We're going to do grid template columns. We're going to repeat. We want 21 columns all at 1 fraction. And what that's going to do is stack everything up in 21 different columns. At first you might be like, what happened? Well, what it's done is it's now spaced these out in columns. So we're going to actually now have to redeclare that we want them to be from top to bottom. So for now that might be confusing, but I'll explain it here in a second. Let's go ahead and set this grid template rows then to auto, and that will help us as we lay this out. What we need to do now is to grab each of those 4 sections. So we had our header here, which was just the tag of header. We had our share, which is a class of share. We had our article itself, which I think was just the tag article. And then we had finally that div that was the aside of sidebar, which is the class. So some of these are classes, some of these are just tags. But what we're going to do in each of these is now say we want a grid area. Now, in my last video, I showed you how to name these and then use those names to lay things out. This time, because we've got all those different columns, we're going to actually use the numbers of those columns and rows to lay things out. So let me show you what this will look like, first of all, just when it comes to the rows themselves. To declare all at once, it'll be at first the row, so we're going to start at row 1, and then the column. I'm going to leave a space for now, and this will go to row 2. I'm going to leave a space, and then eventually we're going to come back in here and fill in these columns. But for now, just to kind of keep this simple, next the share is going to start, as you may have guessed, on row 2 and go to row 3. Then we'll copy this down in the article and the sidebar, and this will start on row 3 and go to row 4, and this will start on row 4 and go to the 5th line of the row there. So all we're doing is saying, hey, stack these up one after the other from top to bottom. Now, the other blanks that I left here are for the columns where I want them to be stacked. Now, if we go back to our Figma, you'll see that on mobile, I actually want the image to be all the way over to the edge here. There are different ways I could have done this. Instead of using these columns, I could have just added padding on the side of each of these individually, but just to show you kind of the flexibility of grid and how easy it is to lay some of this stuff out. What we're going to do is, on this one, we want it to start at column 1 and to go to the last one, which I can just do -1, and it'll figure that out. On all the rest of these, I want them to start on 2 and go to -2. So it starts 1 in, well, 2 in, and then goes to 2 till the end. So I'll go 2 and -2. And then here again, 2 and -2. And if I save this now, they should all stack up just like I want them to. And if I if I pull this over here, you'll notice that all of these, except for this one, are automatically adjusting to this space. Because I set it up as equal 21 widths, 21 columns, as I change that, you'll see that sizing kind of dynamically adjusts because of grid, not because of our custom variables we set up. But this always stays full width all the way across, which is pretty cool. So that's how we're using this. And if you want to see what it looks like, I can hit grid here again. You'll see our 21 columns. They have those gaps in between them. And then you'll notice if I come up here and you can see the numbers here, this is 1, 1 over here. It's starting here. And we're starting the column for header here at column 2. And we're going all the way to -2 right here. So we're just using those numbers to lay out exactly where we want things to go. So that's the basic gist of the whole page, how we're laying it out. Now with each of these sections, we're going to decide whether or not we want grid or flex. In this case, the only thing I really want to change here is just the spacing between things. And probably the easiest way to do that is actually just with grid. So now on this one will also be its own parent for its children. We'll say display grid. It's not going to change anything yet, but that means we can come in here and say gap, and we want var spacer small. And just like that, things space out like we'd want them to. Now let's go ahead and just work on the header, and then we'll jump to these other sections as we are able. Both this category and then the tags down below here, they shared a common class called badge. So I'm going to come in here and say badge like this. And on this badge, we said we wanted it to be background color of HSL, var, and then we want our accent color here. And then we want it to be a, we want it to be a text transform of uppercase and a font size of our var small. And then our color here, this is the color of the font itself, the text itself. We want it to be our var of background, so the same as the background of the page. And then we want a text decoration, so that underline that would naturally be there as it is right now, we want this to be none. If I save it here, you'll notice it goes all the way across, and that's because in grid, it's going to naturally stretch all the way across. So there's a couple different ways to fix this, but probably the easiest here is just to say we want the width of this to be max content. So only take up the max content it needs, and if I do that, it snaps back down. Now both the category and the tags share that same badge class, but then they also each have their own tags as well, or their own classes as well, sorry. So category here will be padding of 2 pixels and 6 pixels, and then we'll copy this down and change it up for tags since we're already here. And we'll say tag here. I think we have this at 1 and 4. It just shows you how you can use classes and have similar components, share some elements, and then separate off the things that need to be separated. Okay, so that's one of the 4 sections totally done, which is cool. Now this next section is this share section. Now here we've got this share element down here below, and if you jump over to the Figma, we actually want it to wrap up top here. But on desktop, we want it over this way. So that's why I semantically laid it out where the image is first, and then this stuff is second. And so what I'm going to do then is use Flex, because I think that'll be easier to kind of get it to wrap properly. So what I'm going to do here is come in here and say we want this to be display flex, and then we want this to be flex wrap of wrap reverse. Now if I do that, it'll actually wrap it up top there. And then I want a gap that's going to mimic the gap between all these things. And because we have those custom variables already set up, we can grab that pretty quickly by saying spacer small. And now it looks like it matches with all this. It may even look like it belongs to this. Now before we fix the spacing here, let's go ahead and add share image like this, and we'll say max width of 100%. That way this is finally spaced out how it should be. Now the 3 social icons are all inside something called share social. What we're going to do here is we could lay these out either way. If I say display grid, it's actually going to space them naturally up and down, whereas if I say display flex, it's going to leave them as they were oriented. So let's just do that so we're not creating extra work for ourselves. We'll do a gap here of 0.9 rem. Unlike grid, Flex's gap property isn't as well supported, but it's getting there, and so I'm just going to go ahead and use it here, but just so you know, you might want to look that up. Now, if I save it here, we still have a spacing problem because it's still not moved over. Now, the spacing we have here is actually not from any of our spacing variables. You might remember it's from our columns on this grid container here. So if you remember, we've got 21 columns, and so we can mimic that same kind of breakdown by setting a margin left. We're going to do a calc here of 100%, so that's 100% of the whole page, divided by 21. So we just want 1/21th of it moved over. 1/21th, is that a thing? I don't know. Now eventually we're going to come over here, and let me actually take this off just so you can see what's going to happen. If I come over this way, and this gets large enough, can I do this? You'll see that this is up this way at the very top. We want it to be at the bottom. And so just to show you what we need to do here while we're here, we're going to need to add to this an align self of end. And this is a child property because it's part of this grid or this flex area. So that'll move it all the way down when we need it to. Let me take this back off, zoom this back in to our normal percent, and then let's get these DevTools back up where they should be too. We've got a couple more things to do to make this look right. Each of those icons is in a div called social card, like this. We're going to set a color of HSL, var text, like that, and then display of flex. If I save it there, you see it kind of adjust a little bit. We're going to add a gap here of 0.6 rem, and that color switches. Now remember, we added these inline SVGs with current color as the color for the fill, and that's why these adjust when we change the color of the parent. We do want text decoration of none so that underline doesn't show. And let's go ahead and say align items center so that the text and the icons all match up. Now whenever we hover or we focus on the social card, we're going to add an is selector here and say that on hover or on focus, we want to change the color to HSL, our var of accent. And if I save this here and I come over hovering over either the SVG or the text, the entire thing changes because again, I've used current color on the SVG, and of course this text is already wrapped inside of that link tag. Now on mobile, you remember we don't actually want the text to show up. We had a class on all of those of social text. So we're going to say display of none, and we'll fix that on desktop by adding it back in. So this actually completes everything we need on the second section as well. So we've got the first section, the header, and now the second section, the share section done. All right, that leaves the article as the next section. Now, how do we want to space this out? We actually don't want to add grid or flex to this, I don't think, but I would like a little more space up top and down below. Now, all of these are sharing this grid gap here of spacer small. So I don't want to change them all, just this one. So what I can do is just add a margin var of spacer medium here, and then we'll have 0 left and right, and that will give us more space on the article, but leave all the other gaps the same. And so that gives us kind of our own custom spacing on this article section. I think that gives it a little bit more room. Next, all the paragraphs here on article. So all those paragraphs, I want to have a margin bottom of var spacer small. So we'll give a little bit more space below each of those, and that will space out the text a little bit better. Now, if these weren't all the exact same, I think that would probably help to make the look a little bit better. You can check out the live code to see what that looks like. So the next section is this article section for the author. So I'm going to say we've got a class here, you might remember, of article author. This is what we added a second ago since we forgot to add it last time. And it's got a border around it. So we're going to say border 6 pixels, solid HSL, var of text. That'll give us that dark color all the way around it. And then we're going to add a padding of our var spacer medium. And again, using these consistent spacings helps us with this. On mobile here, I am going to make it text align center. And then we've got two sections you'll remember. We've got the image and then we've got the details here. So what I'm going to do first of all is I think I'm going to add this as display flex, because if you remember correctly, on desktop it looks like this, and on mobile we want it to stack. And so it'll be easier just to kind of flex those back and forth as we need to. What that means is we can come in here and for now we want to say we want the flex wrap to be wrap. Not warp, but wrap. And that means it'll wrap up and down, and we can work on the spacing there in a second. I'm going to have a gap between those two of our spacer medium. And then let's go ahead and say align items center. We'll do justify content center. If I do that, it should snap everything to the middle, and that should work great. We'll say max width of 900 pixels. which means on like a tablet, before we switch to the mobile view, it'll never get bigger than this. I don't think it needs to be a whole lot bigger than that, and I think that'll look great. And then I'm going to add a margin top because I actually want a little more spacing here that'll mimic the same spacing here. And we're going to calculate it based off of kind of how we got to these spacings. Remember, there's a gap, and then we added a margin. And so we're going to basically calculate to get that same thing. So we're going to have a spacer large minus our var spacer small. So even here, we can use those consistent spacings to make sure it kind of mimics and looks the exact same on both. I think we could also do large, let's see, we could also do medium plus. I think that actually might be technically a little bit closer to it. Either way, you can calculate those to meet our needs. And because these paragraphs are actually inside the article tag, they're picking up that spacing, and I don't really want that. So I'm going to come in here and let's see, that was in a class called article author, what do we call that? Details, I think. What we'll say is all the paragraphs inside there, we want to have a margin bottom of 0. Because of the cascade, this comes later, and so that will cancel out the earlier instruction. We're also going to come in here and grab the article author. Let's see, let me just copy this down here. And it's not looking now at the paragraph, but that capitalized class, I think it would help to have a little more spacing just on that one. So that's what we'll do. We'll say margin 0.2 rem, 0, and then 0.8 rem down below. And that will give a little more spacing on the card and kind of adjust it as we need it to be. Now with the article author image, you might remember we have a kind of an orange circle around that. And I can do here is say margin auto. And then for the width of the image, I'm going to actually use that same clamp idea. And since it's only used here, I'm just going to paste in what I've got already. You can, again, go grab that from that article or do your own sizing here for this. But what I'm saying is at the smallest, I want it to be 100 pixels. At the largest, I want it to be 180 pixels. And basically let the browser figure it all out for me. We can even do it on something like a border. So I could add a clamp here as well from 6 pixels all the way up to 10 pixels for big screens and just say solid HSL var accent like this. And it'll actually just add that and adjust it as we change the screen size. Now, I do need to add a border radius of 50% to make sure we get a circle there. Okay, so that's 3 of the 4 sections done for mobile. Now let's work on this final sidebar section, and then we'll add some media queries so it looks good on desktop as well. Now the sidebar, you might remember that it actually, when it's on smaller sizes like this, it snaps this way. Desktop, it's going to go up and down, and when it gets really small, this will snap below. So I think the easiest thing for that would be Flexbox because it's just moving one orientation just horizontally. It's not, we don't have to align things vertically and horizontally. So I'll just say display flex here, and then we're going to say flex wrap of wrap like that. And that will allow us that when we get smaller screen size, they'll wrap down like that. Okay, so with that said, let's get it back in view here. We're going to add a couple other things here. We want a gap of our var spacer, let's see, spacer large. So that'll be the space between the two of them. And you'll see it spaces out already for us there. Now, as I kind of move these around, you'll notice that it kind of pretty early on snaps to this vertical orientation. And what will help with that is if we actually add some flex property on the children. So we'll do that here in just a second so that it snaps kind of when we expect it to. For now, they both are going to share sidebar header. Let's see, I think I had it as header here. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's change this to header and jump over this way. Let's see, sidebar header. Let's change both of these to use the same formatting I did for the other classes. All right, so if I could jump over here, sidebar header like this, we're going to have border bottom. Here I'll just use a static number of 4 pixels, solid HSL, and then we're going to do our var of text. So that's that dark color. If I save it here, you'll see them show there. I do think we need a little more space, so let's add padding bottom of 0.5 rem, like that. Now with both the sidebar tags and the sidebar related, we want display grid here, and we'll just do a gap of 0.8 rem like that. This will space out these individual items kind of up and down, which should work well for us. Now for the related post section here, so related post, let's see, I think it was post container like that. We'll come in here and we're going to say display of grid and a gap of 0.5 rem like that. That should space those out a little bit better themselves as well. Now individually here we've got these links, and so I'm just going to grab related posts, which are the individual divs that hold those links. We're going to say any link inside of that, we want to have a color of HSL var text. Let's see, var text, like that. And then we want the text decoration to be none. All right, so they lose those blue lines underneath them. Now our tags, the last thing we need to do for mobile here is these tags, we actually need to make some adjustments as well on them. So we're going to come in here and say our tags container, we're going to say display flex. We just want them to be able to wrap when they need to. So we'll say flex wrap of wrap, and then we're going to add a gap as well here of 0.7 rem. Okay, so we've got these things spaced out here. You'll notice a couple weird things though. As we get larger here, you'll see that these are randomly gaining a bunch of height for no reason. And the reason is we haven't declared how we want these two flex children to interact with each other. So it's naturally stretching them to try to meet the same height. So we can change that in a couple different ways. Probably the first thing that's important here is to come up to, let's see, our sidebar itself. And we've got, this is where we've got the parent display flex written. And here we want the align items property to be set to flex start, like that, and that will jump everything up top. We'll come back here in a moment and add one more thing once we get to desktop, but for now, the other thing we're going to need to worry about is as we get a little bit smaller here, as soon as it can, it snaps down, which means pretty early on it's snapping like this. So on smaller screen sizes, we probably want to actually tell it exactly how we want it to interact. So we're going to start to declare some media queries here, and this will be the start of our media queries section. So we'll say only screen and min width. So first of all, we're going to start with 600 pixels here. So it's going to start at 600 pixels. And we're going to say here we want sidebar tags and sidebar related. So those are those two children to be flex. This is the child property of flex grow of 1, flex shrink of 1. So they're going to act the same that way. And we want them to be at 40%. So what you're doing is telling the browser, roughly speaking, try to be 40% and then grow or shrink as you need to be. Now, if I say 50%, here it's going to already snap down and then it's going to spread all the way across there. And that's because we've got some padding and things like that. So I always want to be a little bit less than that and let the browser figure out the difference. And then as I come in here, you'll notice it just snaps when it absolutely has to, when it can't sustain that 40% anymore. And that's about the right time anyhow. So that should work out just great. So we've done that first media query. Now let's copy it down. Let's start to kind of build out the site as we move up to larger screen sizes. So the next media query we're going to worry about is actually 1,000 pixels. So this is getting dangerously close to a desktop, maybe more like a large tablet size. We're going to change a few things to start with. We're going to say the root, first of all, we want the font size to be 18 pixels. This would be the base font size that all those rems are calculated off of. Now, I'm not yet at 1,000 pixels, so it's still 16 at the base, but as I get bigger, you'll notice it changes to 18 on the font. We're also going to change how many columns we have in our kind of parent container over everything. That was the class of container, and here I'm going to say we want the grid template columns to be a repeat, and this time we want it to be a repeat of 15 one fraction. Now what that's going to do is it's going to change the spacing on everything. And you'll notice it does that, and again, we're at 1,000 pixels. I'm doing that to actually give us a little bit more spacing on the sides when we get bigger up there, and we'll also use that to lay things out a little bit differently as far as how it's spaced. But because we calculated this section off of that 21 column setup, now we need to adjust that as well. So I'm going to come in here and say share social is going to be margin left. You may remember we just did a calculation here, so calc 100% divided by 15 now, and that should work and make it look like it's part of this new system. Now let's go ahead and start adjusting where things are going to stack up. So we're going to grab the article tag here, and we're going to say we want the grid area to now be still the same rows. So let's set those out. It was 3 and 4 is what it was between, but now we're actually going to shift where we want it to show column to column. We want it to start at 2, just like it used to, but this time we want it to go to only 10. Remember, we've got 15 now, and if I come over here, let's pull this inspection panel back up, you'll notice it's actually snapping over this way. If I grab this grid, you'll notice it's starting at number 2, so this is 1 line, 2 line, going all the way to 10. I won't count those out for you. And that means we want our sidebar now to take up the remaining space. So I'll come in here and we're going to say we want our sidebar to be grid area. We want it to be the same row as the article now. So it'll be 3 and 4. And then for the column, we're going to start at 11. So we're going to give it that natural spacing between the two. It'll have a column that's blank between them. And then here, we're going to say we want it to be to the -2. So 1 away from the edge still, so it's got that spacing off to the edge. And now it stacks up like that. Now, there's a couple things we need to fix. One of them is you'll notice that this spacing now is not consistent. Remember we added that extra margin up top here? It's clear now that it's not on this. So we need to actually add that. So let's start with that. We'll just declare the same margin that we had on the article itself. So spacer medium is what that was, up and down, and then 0 left to right. And that should space that out properly. The other thing is these are spaced on the opposite extremes, or I guess centrally here. So what we're going to do is come back all the way up, and let's just do it here on this flex, on the sidebar itself. In the mobile, it's not going to hurt anything on mobile. We'll say align content now, flex start. And that should actually jump everything up so where it's aligning up top on desktop like that. Okay, back down to our media query. There's a couple other things that we're going to work on. You might remember that when we showed this article or the author card on desktop, we want it to actually flex this way and have this kind of orange banner. If I pull back over here to the Figma, you'll see that there. So we can accomplish that by coming over here and saying article author. We're going to say, first of all, text align of left. And then now we want the flex wrap to be no wrap. And that will remove that wrap and kind of set it back to its normal default with flex. And then we're going to say position of relative. And that will allow us to create a pseudo element here that we can place as that little orange box. So we'll say article author before pseudo element. You always have to have a content even if you don't have any content like that. And then we're going to say position absolute. And here we're just going to set a default width of 26 pixels and then a height of 80%. Because it's only showing up on desktop here, we don't need to mess with like it adjusting dynamically. It'll be just fine as is. If I save it here, you'll see nothing really happens, and that's because we haven't added a color. So let's add a background color here, and we'll do HSL again, and then our var of accent. If I save this, it should now show up, but it's just right in the middle. So we need to adjust it by making sure we move it all the way over where it needs to be. If I said left 0, you'll see it brings it right to the edge. So what I want is actually half of this width here. So I already know it's 13 pixels would be half of that width, and so that should stack it up, but you'll notice it doesn't quite fit that way, and I think that's because of some weird spacing issues. So what I found works is just to come in here and say calc, and we're going to take our var of spacer medium, and then we're going to multiply it times -0.4, like that. And that should always keep it right in the middle, no matter kind of where we're at. All right, so believe it or not, we've just got one more media query, and then we're all done with this project. I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to add this media query. This time, we're now looking at kind of big screen sizes. So after 1,000 pixels, we're going to get up to 1440 like that. Here, we're going to say container. We actually are going to switch back to our grid template columns of repeat 21 and 1 fraction. So we're going back to our 21 column layout. Now this again just adjusts for the sizing. There's other ways to do this, but just to show you how easy it is to kind of switch columns, I think that's a nice way to lay stuff out. We're going to say our side bar tags now and our side bar related. We're going to change this flex to 1, 1, and 100%. If we don't do it, what's going to happen is these are going to stack next to each other like they did on like a tablet size. And what we're saying is at the biggest screen size, we want these to both take up the full width rather than stacking left to right, which would happen if we don't add this 100%. We've also got our social text. That's our text that's next to those social icons. We want this to be display of block. Remember, we hid those to start with, but now we actually want them to show up on the side. Let's see if I can do this. I might need to just zoom out on the page itself because I've got these stacked next to each other. All right, so now they're showing up over this way, but they're still laid out like this, and we don't quite want that. So we need to fix that as well. So we're going to say share social. That again was that div that held those icons. Now we want the flex direction to be column. That will stack them up and down, kind of like the default for grid at this point. And then we're going to say we want there to be a gap of 0.9 rem in between them, and then margin left. Now we want to match the column that's going to be here once we move all this stuff over. So that will eventually be our var spacer of medium here. I'm going to come in here and I want to change a few things here. Now with the article, I'm going to change the grid area again here. So grid area is going to be 3 and 4 for the rows. And then for the columns, we're going to switch it to 3 to 15, because remember, we're back to 21. And then I'm going to copy this down, and we're going to change this out to sidebar like this. And this grid area will be 3 and 4. Again, they're sharing the same section, except this time it's going to start at 15 and be -2. And then we'll adjust for that spacing as it gets all the way big enough to actually fit that. Let me zoom out just a touch more. Oh, that's a little bit too much. This is just zooming out on the browser itself. I think something like that might give us the most realistic view here. We're going to set a margin left of calc. We're going to say our var of spacer medium. That's the same as this margin left here. And then we're going to add to it our var of spacer small, which is the gap between the different columns on our parent grid. So if I save this, it will actually space out properly here. If I jump over this way, all the way to the finished product, you'll see what happens is they stack up right against each other as if they're in line, which is what we want it to look like. It's hard because I'm split screen here and it's not letting me zoom out without kind of doing a funky zoom in, and it's not giving us a realistic picture of how this works. Now, a couple other things to note here. This should be a completed project as we move in and out here. In fact, maybe what I'll do is just pull this out and then I'll jump it out to its own so you can make sure that it's complete. Now I do this, I'm seeing they're not actually lining up properly. So let's see what's going on here. All right, so I come in here and it looks like this section here, sidebar here, should have a margin left. Nothing much is happening. If I remove this, it doesn't look like it's doing a whole lot of anything. So let me make sure I've got this set correctly. Var spacer medium plus our var of spacer small. I think I see the problem here. This should be a double dash here, and now they all line up properly. So let's change that. Let's jump all the way over here to our spacer of small. Come back all the way over. Here I've got these all lined up the wrong way, but this should now look correct. And if I go to a smaller screen size, you'll see that it should snap down properly. This goes center just like we want it to. If we get a little bit bigger, they'll snap next to each other like that. Everything else looks great. This still stays full screen. Once we get big enough, this should eventually snap these down here. Now the word show as well, then these come out this way. When we come all the way out, they now should line up properly this way. One other thing to note about our dark mode that I didn't mention earlier, when I switch to dark mode here, one of the things you want to check with whenever you do this is that this contrast shows properly. So you'll notice here I'm getting a 10.16. Now you should get at least one checkbox. If you get 2 check marks, you've kind of passed the highest form of accessibility, but these are all passing at least the 1 check mark box, and that's what you want for each of these here. This one's 7.6. It could be a little bit better, so you can adjust those colors as you want to, but that is something to note when it comes to accessibility. Well, I hope this was helpful for you, kind of seeing how to lay out these and using Grid and Flexbox interchangeably whenever one suits your needs better than the others. There are, of course, other ways to do this. This is just one take on how you might lay out this page, but the thought process hopefully is helpful for you. If you have questions, leave them in the description below. And thanks for your patience as we worked through this kind of slowly. I trust it was a big help to you. Thanks so much for watching, and happy coding.